for being with us here today. Ms. Baker, I know this question has been asked earlier, but I'd like to re-ask with a little bit different flavor. The Tax Foundation's book minimum tax model estimates that imposing a 15% book minimum tax will increase the tax liability of Spectrum license owners by $7.2 billion over 10 years. Like many West Virginians, I'm concerned that this tax increase will delay closing the digital divide.
Now, Senator Richard Blumenthal and Chris Murphy said in the joint statement, these payments are possible because the American Rescue Plan cannot come at a better time for families. Back-to-school shopping is always expensive, and with the increased cost of food, gas, and other basic necessities, Connecticut families are feeling the pressure, and we are pleased to see that funding we fought for in Congress delivered to the people who need it the most. Now, Democrat Joe Manchin is the least popular political figure in the new national NBC News poll, with just 11% of registered voters saying they have had positive feelings about the Virginia Democrats. Roughly one-third of voters had negative feelings, making Manchin the unpopular figure in the poll. Manchin also had a share of voters who said they did not know or were not sure how they felt about him. The disdain for Manchin spanned political parties with 40% of Democrats and 31% of Republicans. And there's also huge developments on the new Inflation Reduction Act. Lawmakers are concerned about the current state of the economy. Economists have announced that the Biden administration must take action to avoid a recession. Now, the Inflation Reduction Act, which is the most aggressive climate investment ever taken by Congress, could cut the social cost of climate change by up to $1.9 trillion by 2050. The White House has said in an official statement that the legislation will reduce costs related to rising temperatures, minimize property damage from sea level rise and other disasters, and reduce health impacts. The analysis of the Office of Management and Budget, which administers the federal budget, is the first published estimate of avoided climate-related social costs resulting from legislation. The social cost of carbon is an estimate of the economic cost that would occur from a future level of carbon pollution. And the bill's climate provisions are projected to reduce the country's carbon emissions by roughly 40% by 2030. Early in his presidency, Joe Biden pledged to reduce U.S. emissions from 2005 levels, at least in half by 2030, and achieve net zero emissions by 2050. In the shorter term, the analysis projects the bill will save between roughly $34 billion and $84 billion each year by the end of the decade. Climate-related disasters could cost the U.S. federal budget roughly $2 trillion per year, a 7.1% loss in annual revenue by the end of the century. There are three main ways the bill targets rising prices. First, it plans to reduce the federal deficit, which is the difference between how much the U.S. government spends and how much it takes in taxes and revenue. And when there's less money floating in the economy, there tends to be less demand and fewer price hikes. Second, it will promote the production of certain goods, mainly in renewable energy. Having more supply than demand can help lower some cost over time, he added. Third, and more directly, one provision of the bill will help limit the price growth of certain prescriptions,
as these companies will have fewer dollars to spend on resources to deploy 5G and other spectrum capabilities. Is it your understanding that enacting the 15% minimum tax on book income as written in the tax and spend bill will raise taxes on spectrum license holders, thereby raising prices on already financially strapped consumers?
It is. I'm hopeful for a technical correction so that we can consider spectrum auction holdings the same as other infrastructure holdings.
So it is meaning what? It will raise taxes.
It's both retroactive on the over 200 million that our carriers have spent on spectrum, as well as proactively. I think it can harm. They're going to have to come up with the tax to pay for what they actually already hold that they were not expecting. I think that can harm broadband build-out. I think that can harm the digital divide and will slow things down. Going forward, it will have to be built into spectrum policy when companies bid on spectrum.
Thank you. Again, Ms. Baker, the infrastructure bill set forth a significant investment in high-speed and broadband in the U.S., and as a result, more Americans are connecting. How can we ensure, in light of the conversations that we've had today, that there is sufficient spectrum to allow consumers and businesses to fully utilize these broadband networks, particularly, as you know, in my state, a lot of unserved and underserved areas?
Well, we really appreciate this committee's work on the infrastructure bill and also their emphasis to make it technology neutral. It is fiber leaning, and as we are working with the states as they develop their plans individually to hope that they realize the power of wireless and they realize the power of 5G home broadband, that they can serve unserved areas in a sometimes a more efficient way. I think, as Mr. Lewis has said, getting broadband to all America is a big challenge, and it's going to require an all of the above process. And so we just want to be included in people's decisions as they make their plans.
Yeah, I would say this, so the entire panel asked this question. Is there a question of whether there's enough spectrum to handle this, or will it be robust enough for the harder areas to reach? How do you all think about this? We'll start on this end.
Thank you for the question. In rural areas, the spectrum is not as constrained because there's few users, but the same amount. There, it's a problem of economics, so you need to fix the market imperfections that don't allow the market to serve those areas.
So would that be just affordability types of issues, not enough customer?
Work that you do every day in this space. Next, we will hear from Senator Moran. Senator Moran, you're recognized for question.
Chairman Lujan, thank you very much. Our four panelists, thank you for your presence and the words, wisdom you are imparting. I first want to state to my colleagues on this and the full committee that I am supportive of an 18-month auction authority extension to the FCC as probably the best path forward. But I also would indicate, and you said this, Ms. Baker, and I think it's important, certainly important to me, and I would assume to my colleagues, that I want Congress to have a role in determining the spectrum auctions and where the proceeds go. And as you indicated, we've been left out. I also know in our efforts on the bipartisan infrastructure bill that we were unable to get any credit for offsets as a result of the fact that Congress had no authority in that regard to how the proceeds were spent. My questions generally have been asked by my colleagues, but I'd turn probably to you, Mr. Von Ah. The deployment of reallocated spectrum does not always go smoothly, and we've seen that recently with the C-band 5G deployment delay. One of the prime issues the GAO found in studying NTIA and the FCC spectrum reallocation policies is that there is inadequate federal coordination. GAO suggests a number of ways to improve federal coordination in both the June 21 and the January 22 GAO studies. Do those recommendations, any of those recommendations, account for the issues recently encountered in the C-band 5G deployment? If not, how would you recommend preventing similar occurrences in the future in terms of agency coordination?
Thank you for the question, Senator Moran. It's hard to say exactly if it was that issue in the C-band, but I think the recommendations can go to some of the issues that came up there. There was certainly opportunity early on for FAA to express concerns. Those concerns weren't expressed. And so more and earlier coordination between FCC, NTIA, and a heads up from FCC to NTIA about upcoming proceedings would allow NTIA and FAA to explore some of those issues and make bring those issues to light in FCC proceedings. So yes, I think those recommendations can help.
It sounds like